Originally, I had planned on coming here today to give testimony concerning the accessibility of international travel and study abroad for Americans, and in particular Tennesseans with disabilities. According to the current statistics, 1 in 8 U.S. jobs depend on travel, and 97% of students who study abroad find employment within 12 months after graduation. As a student roughly 6 years ago, I joined a group of more than 30 from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga on a research trip to the South Pacific. For 2 weeks, we traveled to Fiji, New Zealand, Australia, and Hawaii, researching disability access, including physical, attitudinal, and cultural barriers. While this trip was one of the best experiences of my life, it was not without challenges. It opened my eyes to a world beyond the security of my own. I have muscular dystrophy and have used a wheelchair for most of my life. While there is still much work to be done in the United States, I live a luxuriously accessible life compared to millions of people with disabilities in other countries. I shudder at the thought that individuals with disabilities are unable to travel because so many countries remain inaccessible. It is even harder for me to consider the daily limitations of those citizens with disabilities who live in countries without curb cuts, without ramps, without elevators, without the right to access the same places and do the same things that their friends and family can. More gruesome still is the knowledge that countless others are being abused, raped, neglected, and denied equal access to healthcare and civil rights because of their disability. In an effort to stand in opposition of such disregard of human rights, 141 countries have ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, commonly known as CRPD. Yet the United States, a leader in civil rights for people with disabilities, is not on the list. In fact, several U.S. senators, including those from the state of Tennessee, oppose ratification. I'm going to share with you the state of affairs in several countries. As a world leader, the United States far exceeds most nations in the establishment of civil rights legislation for people with disabilities. Although some nations, such as Peru and India, have made significant efforts towards improving the rights of citizens with disabilities, the same cannot be said of others. Overall, the current state of affairs for people with disabilities worldwide is abhorrent at best. In Ghana, people with mental disabilities are being imprisoned in psychiatric hospitals, masquerading as healing centers, where they are subjected to electroshock therapy and chained inside cells in an attempt to cure them. Similarly, in Turkey, it is common for electroconvulsive therapy to be used on individuals without any form of anesthesia, muscle relaxant, or oxygenation. A 10-year-old girl with a disability in Kenya was raped, but the case thrown out of court because sign language interpreters were unavailable. Recent reports by Disability Rights International found that persons with disabilities in Mexico and Paraguay were being abused and neglected, left sitting in their own waste. In 1980, Russia refused to host the Paralympics on the grounds that they had no citizens with disabilities. Even today, although the country is now prepared to welcome visitors and athletes with disabilities during the 2014 Winter Olympics and Paralympics, Russia is far from accessible. Many people with disabilities are still unable to leave their homes, let alone access public buildings and transportation. Police in Rwanda abused a man with a mental disability so severely his arms were amputated from infections caused by restraints. In Serbia, people with disabilities are chained to beds labeled by type of disability rather than their name, lying in darkness. Aside from blatant discrimination against people with disabilities, these countries have one thing in common. They all ratified the CRPD. Shocking. And you might ask where we come in, where the United States, and in particular Tennessee, comes in. The reality is that non-executing agreements such as CRPD cannot be policed by the United Nations nor enforced in a court of law. In fact, while most countries ratify such treaties, much of these statements fail to translate into policy or program development and implementation. As previously observed, several countries who ratify CRPD are failing to take action towards self-enforcement. Such failures are due as much to lack of resources as they are to social and cultural values. That is exactly where the United States can be most valuable. Like many countries today, there was a time when the United States failed to ensure and uphold the rights of people with disabilities. Before the early disability rights laws of the 70s and 80s, to name a few, the Rehabilitation Act in 1973, Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act in 1975, and the Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act in 1980, and the 1999 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Olmstead, thousands of individuals with disabilities were wrongfully institutionalized in filthy conditions. Since then, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the Amendments Act of 2008 work to ensure equal treatment of Americans with disabilities. In Tennessee, the Tennessee Disability Coalition, which began as an informal ad hoc group in 1984, continues to work towards improving the lives of Tennesseans with disabilities. Today, the U.S. is the world standard in disability rights legislation. In many ways, the U.S. is the foremost leader in providing for and protecting the rights of its citizens, legal residents, and foreign tourists with disabilities. But we can no longer ignore the fact that even as we move forward, people with disabilities in other countries continue to be mistreated and abused, while their governments either fail or refuse to intervene. U.S. ratification of the CRPD would provide for the ability to influence other nations to take actions toward upholding the law. The CRPD applies the same human and civil rights standards which exist in the U.S. through the ADA to other nations. While some of the countries which have adopted the treaty have begun developing legislation to improve the lives of people with disabilities, others are still struggling. The U.S. is in a position of power and should take this opportunity to offer assistance and expertise. Last year, the CRPD failed to be ratified by 6 votes. This past December, Senator Corker, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, along with Senator Lamar Alexander, refused to continue discussing the legislation. Not only does failure to ratify the CRPD deny Americans with disabilities the freedom to travel without fear, it is effectively turning our backs on millions of people with disabilities worldwide. In 1987, Justin Dart, often referred to as the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act, stood before Congress and said, "An inflexible federal system, like the society it represents, still contains a significant portion of individuals who have not yet overcome obsolete, paternalistic attitudes toward disability." While this was pre-ADA and the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed on July 26, 1990, culminating decades of work by disability advocates, we must now acknowledge the rights of our international community. If the United States fails to ratify the CRPD, the words spoken by Justin Dart more than 20 years ago will ring true once more. Are there any questions? Yes?
I can't imagine why Alexander and Corker didn't vote for ratification. I have heard this before, but I hadn't heard the answer. What's the answer?
It's actually, in my opinion, a fairly lame excuse. They claim that ratification of CRPD by the United States will infringe upon U.S. sovereignty and our democratic system.
That sure does answer that, doesn't it?
Do you mind if I speak?
Oh, go right ahead. This is Michelle Rigler, for those of you that don't know, the director of the Disability Resource Center at
I have a loud
EDC.
voice. I'm okay.
Yeah.
No, we're trying. No, we
You won't use the mic.
I'm sorry.
She's been working as well in trying to get the U.S. to, in trying to get Tennessee to support CRPD.
We're trying to get you on the video, so we
I'm
have
sorry.
records.
I recently was invited to go meet with Senator Corker and a lot of the national organizations in D.C., along with some people from the Tennessee Disability Coalition. And initially, his staff said that in looking at the language of the CRPD, that there are some things that could be done that would make them feel more comfortable with it and that they could work to a solution. But then recently, they just completely pulled out of conversations and said they don't want to hear it anymore. And basically, that's what it comes down to, is the fear that somehow this UN, what am I trying to say?
Treaty.
That this UN treaty will somehow threaten our democratic policy and the way we do government. And when we were asking him those questions, he wasn't able to clarify. And then at that point, we said, well, your staffers assured us that we could get to a point where we could work this out, and he didn't want